Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Arif Rüzgar. I am Program Director for Economics and Trade at the Rosalux Luxembourg Foundation based in Brussels. I'd like to welcome everyone in the name of the Rosa Luxembourg Foundation to today's webinar, AfCFTA Context, External Interest and Finance. I would also like to thank SEATINI for the cooperation and partnership. This is the second webinar in a series of 4 on the African Free Trade Area. 2 more are planned, one on migration and labor challenges on 17 June and another on agriculture on 12 August. I hope you stay tuned for the upcoming events, and I wish you all an informative and exciting panel for today. I would like to leave the floor to Sylvester and the panelists, and also to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Arif, for those remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Sylvester Bagoro, and I'm a program officer at toegther Network Africa, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. As Arif said, it is second in the series of the webinars on Africa's continental free trade area, organized by SEATINI and supported by Rosalux Europa. And of course, SEATINI has been a long pillar of the Africa Trade Network. It's a Pan-African trade and development campaign network in Africa. The focus of the webinar today will be on financing the AfCFTA and exploring possible external interest. As you know, the AfCFTA negotiation processes and the activities at all levels, whether it's the African Union level, whether it's the regional economic communities, or the national level, they're receiving external financing in addition to any domestic funding. Special mention will be of Chinese funding and that of European and German funds into the AfCFTA. That are financing the negotiation process as well as projects at the implementation phase for those protocols that are concluded. We have concluded the protocols and rules, and so that is those that are concluded. If you take a look at the Treaty of Abuja in 1991, when the member states of the then OAU, African Organization of African Unity, agreed on a roadmap for the creation of a common African market, key among that roadmap was to establish an African continental free trade area to advance the aspirations of Africa's people for a prosperous continent. I mean, that was the thinking. That trust, if you look at that document of that treaty, is production and sectorial linkages. That African economies must ensure high productivity and sectorial linkages among the various sectors, minerals, agriculture, services, in order to create value within the continent, jobs and incomes for Africa's people. Now, central to that kind of production is the role of finance. And that is where the webinar is coming in. Its ownership and its intermediation function in the production and linkages. The source of financing of the negotiations of the AfCFTA could have an influence on the content and the rules of the AfCFTA. Also, at the implementation stage, once RECs and member states do not have autonomous financing mechanisms, funds might be difficult to be directed to the sectors that are of interest to Africa and Africa's people. Hence, control of finance and financing mechanisms in the AfCFTA are very important and central to Africa's development. To help us explore the issues of finance and external interest in the AfCFTA, we have a panel of experts that have agreed to respond to questions that were posed to them by me as your moderator and you as a participant. And so this is the approach we're going to use is Q&A approach. After the first round, we hope to create much more time for participants to ask questions. And so I want to quickly introduce the panelists we have today. We have 4 panelists. The first one is Frank Mujeni. He is the coordinator of the African Minerals Development Center. Is a center in charge of development minerals in Africa, coming out from the African Mining Vision that was adopted in 2009. After that, we also have Ms. Jiong Wang. I mean, he is a PhD candidate in international relations. We also have Dr. Ndogo Sila. He's a research and program manager with the Rosalux Europa Foundation West Africa office, Dakar. I now have Bernard Troster. He's a researcher, Austrian Research Foundation for International Development. So these are the people who help us explore the external financing and then interest on the AfCFTA. Just not to kick the ball rolling, I would like to go to Mr. Frank Mujeni, who is from the AMGC, and to ask you to have the floor. And then what I want you to do is to tell us some of the African initiatives in financing the implementation of the AfCFTA, and not only AfCFTA. I know the African Mineral Development Center, all the initiatives from the African continent. I mean, our focus on AfCFTA, but do we have any financing, any financing plan for the implementation and even the negotiations? So, Mr. Frank, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sylvester. And actually, at the time I was requested to come in as a panel of experts, member of the panel, I was coordinating the institutional support project for the African Continental Free Trade Area, an African Development Fund project for institutionalization and the implementation of the African Union Continental Free Trade Area. So it is actually just a few days ago that my role changed now to go back and coordinate become the interim coordinator of the African Minerals Development Center. So greetings to everybody, and I'm really very happy to be here. So originally I was contacted in my capacity earlier on as someone coordinating an institutional support project for the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. And thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so happy that you touched on the Abuja Treaty, because the Abuja Treaty is one of the key Bibles that I think is very critical, is very important for Africa. But it also comes from the Lagos Plan of Action that we should be self-sustaining, self-sufficient. So this question of financing our development is not in isolation with the initiatives that has been coming and how Africa strategizes itself in terms of achieving its goals, its own development agenda. And as of now, we are into Agenda 2063. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a flagship project for the Agenda 2063, amongst others. But also we have a framework for boosting intra-African trade, and the African Continental Free Trade Area is actually among that framework, which was adopted by the heads of state in 2012. And thereafter, they said, okay, as one of the instruments for achieving boosting intra-African trade, from where we are as a continent, trading maybe among between 16–18% of intra-African trade to at least raise it to 25–30%, not even to where our other partners, the Americas and the Europe and Asians are, but at least to take it from one level to another. And knowing that most of our intra-African trade is informal, how do we regularize it and make it formal through instruments that then can boost that intra-African trade through a continental free trade area? You may know that the negotiations which kicked off in 2015 and got concluded partially in 2017, and in 2018 we launched the trading the goods portion of the AfCFTA. We launched the operational phase of trading goods, and now we are trying to conclude the negotiations of trading services. But along the way, you ask yourself, who has been financing all this process? The AfCFTA kicked in at the point that Africa was also negotiating with other partners, other frameworks, including the economic partnership agreements. So most of the negotiations part were supported by our partners, development partners, more particularly the European Union, who supported and still support the process of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But now we are going into the implementation phase. And I saw in the background notes people talking about the 10 million from Ghana. The 10 million from Ghana actually was for supporting the institutionalization, the creation of the secretariat. But by and large, we want to look at beyond the hosting of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and what are the frameworks that member states are going to put in place to ensure that the implementation is homegrown and owned by Africa. As of now, we are still, as African Union, as African member states, we are still constrained in terms of mobilizing resources for development, not only for AfCFTA, but for others. And I was happy that the introducer, the moderator, talked about the Abuja Treaty, talking about those linkages, those development linkages, production linkages. In fact, when you talk about Chapter 9 of the Abuja Treaty, which looks at natural resources, investment, and science and technology, it doesn't ever talk about mining, it doesn't ever talk about agriculture. It talks about agro-industries, metallurgical, and cooperation in industrialization and industrialization policies. So we have that where we want to look at, and how do we take it from there. The member states, if I start with the member states, at the secretariat level, the secretariat is what is in Accra, because the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area will take place at different levels. We have the secretariat, which is the the expert of Africa that support the implementation process, supporting member states to put in place the AfCFTA instruments, rule of origin, non-tariff barriers, and so forth, that we require to ensure that there is trading. We'll have a physical, implementation at the private sector, because the private sector is the one which is going to be trading. They are the ones who are going to be moving goods from one country to another. They look. When you go into trading, it is not determined by a policy at the African Union or a policy of the continental. It's not an affirmative action. You have to make money. You have to move your goods from one point to the other, and those goods might meet standards, they might reach in time, and they be competitive in terms of price with other goods that are on the ground. So where is Africa on that? We still have to have really what is going to frame the reducing the cost of production, the cost of transaction within the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Then we shall have look at the harmonization of these instruments. We'll have to have the harmonization of customs instruments, customs systems at sub-regional level, and international level. At the continental level. When I take you back slightly on when the thinking of the African Continental Free Trade Area, emerged.
Maybe before you go back to the thinking, the key. One of the things you mentioned is the EU funding. Maybe I want to bring in the Bernard from the EU, and then maybe in the response session, you can actually talk more about what you're about to say. And so let me just you mentioned in your presentation that we are getting a lot of funding from the EU because we had the EPAS negotiations, and so the European Union continued with that. Maybe Mr. Bernard, maybe you can tell us some of we see just like even Mr. Frank said, a lot of funding from the EU and Germany. So what can you say are some of the interests of Germany or the EU in this? If you can tell it within 5 to 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. And as you said, I'm here to give you some idea how, from a European perspective, the African free trade area can be seen now. And as Frank already mentioned, that the EU has always been a very important partner for the African Union and the African states. But obviously, the roles changed, especially over the last 20 years. And I guess that this also came along with the different ideas that backed actually the economic partnership agreement that Frank also mentioned, that have been partially introduced in some African blocs already. But what is important to understand, I guess, is that there is a specific understanding for free trade and also regional integration from the EU side, or more specifically from the European Commission side, meaning that that the EU is on the international level a strong advocate for trade liberalization and investment liberalization, and it's thought as a mean for growth and economic development. So the basic idea is that you start off with free trade and it creates benefits, it gets you cheaper imports, imports, then you go for specialization, and you have this dynamic through more competition. And that's something that also Frank mentions. You're getting more efficient and you get higher productivity levels once you open up to trade. That's the general idea, saying why the EU is emphasizing this and also welcoming the initiative on the African Continental Free Trade Area so much. What the EU is also proposing is the regional integration, given that the European Union has its own experience and somewhat positive experience with also political integration on the continent. And what it also brings, this regional integration, is that it's a legal framework. You have the same regulations, same standards, etc. So it creates a large internal market with a full freedom to move goods, services, and capital, and even people now. However, I must say that this is like a very limited or very narrow focus on trade liberalization. I mean, this comes then to the strong support for the African Continental Free Trade Area, using it as the trade liberalization as a development strategy. And it's also like going to the same direction, because the long-term vision of the area is to have like a common union, and having also the African Union as an equal partner with the European Union. But there are obviously then, from my perspective, problems that come along with it, because the strategy to simply go for trade liberalization, that's actually insufficient to particularly to address then the lack of industrial capacities. So arguing that it's only a way to open up for trade, and then automatically you will gain a dynamic that will introduce more dynamics in the private sector, and you go to the most efficient firms, and African continent will prosper just because it opens up its borders and limits and lowers its tariff. That, I guess, is not enough. Nevertheless, the European Union was a strong supporter, and is still a strong supporter going to this way. And there are multiple funds and financial support. This started with the negotiations. These were supported, but there are many other funds and sources to finance something like what you could call aid for trade. So helping to update standards and regulation on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, or technical barriers to trade, etc. There's this one thing, and the other part is that the European Union also tries now to get their private sector getting more involved into the African market, and this was raised.
Just a very important point that you are raising. I mean, when Frank was talking about the Lagos Treaty and the origin of the AfCFTA, it's talking about the autonomous nature of the AfCFTA. Now, European Union is actually having other free trade agreements or investment agreements that are in contrast to the logic. The logic, because you made mention that yes, trade liberalization is good, but you have to make sure you have the capacity to be able to trade. That is very important. So production comes first before trade. And so you see that there's a clash of logic between some of the things that are pushed by the European Union, in once I mentioned the EPAS and stuff and all that, and then the things that the Frank was talking about. How do we reconcile this? Because you can see that the logic do not match.
Yeah, I mean, one indicator how this logic also changed, it was a change in perspective from the European side towards the African countries and partners, meaning that it's that they tried to stop their perspective only focusing on the problems in Africa, or having like Africa as a poor partner that has to be supported through aid and has to be supported through funds, etc. And so, but what they changed is actually then the view and the instruments how to implement then development or economic development through trade liberalization. And one important instrument has been the Economic Partnership Agreement, because what it ended is this unilateral preferential access, so that African export could go to Europe more or less without tariffs. But this ended with the EPAs. And I mean, it took a long time, almost 20 years, to negotiate the economic partnership agreements with the African partners, because there is obviously the problem that just opening up and getting more import competition from European goods in, that's not a, that's very problematic, actually.
Let me, for the sake of time, let me bring in Ms. Jiang Wang. I mean, we have we have heard from the EU perspective. We want to hear from the China and Africa relations. I mean, if you check most of the African countries, you have a lot of relation with China. So can we listen to you? I mean, what are the implications of some of the, what I call the debt overhang, you know, from China and Africa-China relations? What can you say are the implications for the AfCFTA? You have 5 to 7 minutes to make your input.
Yes, I actually prepared a presentation specifically dealing with discussions, concerns over China's debt trap diplomacy. So may I share my screen right now? And I'll try to make sure I finish the presentation within my limit. Let's see. Give me one moment. Share. All right. Is the screen share successful? Yes.
Yes, please.
That is a yes. All right. So thank you everyone for coming today. So there's Chinese loans to Africa has been growing very quickly in the past 10 to 20 years, and that is most of this money are focused on specific countries with natural resources, but there are plenty that goes to countries without natural resources, and most of these went into infrastructure development, a sector that tends to be cash starved because they don't usually generate their own internal revenue. So you think about how much money does your sewage system generate for you? It doesn't quite work like some projects do. So you think about telecom projects or even power projects. Yes, they do generate their internal revenue, but not always, right? So this graph right here, this is a comparison of Chinese Exim Bank loans to the World Bank loans. Let me just double check. Okay, to the World Bank loans. And you can see 2010, what happened in 2010, there's a divergence of where the World Bank provided more Chinese financing than than China Exim Bank. And you remember what happened, that was the Great Recession, right? So this chart should show you very clearly that China Exim Bank, which is the predominant policy bank in Africa for the past 20 years, is, after all, it is an export credit agency. It's not an aid agency. All right, so this brings into the question whether comparing World Bank to China Exim Bank is even a useful comparison. Mm-hmm. There's benefits to that, but we'll see in the next few slides. So I'm going to take you from the ground up to the top. Okay, so how do these Chinese loans happen? What is the process by which these loans come about? So the way these happen is, for most projects, especially medium-sized projects, we're not talking about the really big mega projects like the standard gauge railways. The Chinese contractors themselves, they scout out potential contracts on the ground themselves. They look for places where, the local African government posted a bid for a certain contract, and they compete for the contract. In the process of competing for those contracts, they tell the host countries that, well, if you give the contract to us, be this building roads, building power plants, if you give the contract to us, there is a chance we can get you China Exim Bank financing, okay? So if the contract do end up with the Chinese contractors and the host country governments together, they go to China Exim Bank and they apply for funding. So this is a process. Now, why is this important? Because this implicitly means that China Exim Bank loan finance project goes to Chinese companies. As I said, they are an export credit agency. Their mandate, right, is to promote Chinese companies in competing for business abroad. Right? That is their goal. So there are a few exceptions where Exim Bank loan finance projects goes to contractors of other countries, but those are rare. Well, here's the important thing to keep in mind. What are the alternatives? We're worried about Chinese loans to Africa, but what were some of the options available to African governments? So broadly speaking, there are three categories. You can say, okay, there's China Exim Bank, and then you have your OECD financiers. So you think about your World Banks, your European investment funds, your Japans, your Germany, France, UK, all of those OECD DAC financiers. Think of them as one category. And then on the other side, you have the market. These are the Euro bonds. That if you want as much money as you want, you can always go to the market for it. Now, how do these compare? So OECD financiers tend to have the lowest rate. So the World Bank interest rates are very low. In comparison, China Exim Bank's the interest rate is comparatively higher, but it is still cheaper than market rate loans. So it's still way cheaper than your Euro bonds. And in terms of size, what are the amounts available, right? So progressively, so for OECD financiers, these official flows tends to be smaller through the past 30 to 20 years. They haven't, even the World Bank, which is a premier financier infrastructure projects in Africa, they're not going to they don't have the budget to fork out 2 to 3 billion for a railway project. Even if they really want to, they don't have the budget for it. In comparison, China Exim Bank can. They do have that money if they want to. If they like a project enough, they'll do it. And the same thing with the market, right? If you get the Euro bond, well, you can go into the billions really fast. Now, it's not that simple, right? You think about, well, if OECD financing is that, it's cheaper, why don't we just finance? Well, we know they don't finance everything. There are projects the World Bank simply would not finance. There are projects that European Investment Bank would not finance. So think about your coal power plants, right? Even if they have good rates, you cannot access them for certain projects. In comparison, qualifying is less restrictive for China Exim Bank in terms of projects. You want a coal power plant, you have a good, plan for it, they'll lend you money and they'll build it for you. And the same thing with the market. And the thing is, the market is even less restrictive than the Exim Bank on the types of project they will finance. Exim Bank is not going to lend money to finance, to plug budget holes, right? They won't lend you money for paying your public employee salaries. The Eurobond does not care. As long as you pay them back, you use it however you like. And then finally, you have the political and fiscal conditions. So more restrictive for OECD DAC financiers, less restrictive for Exim Bank, and almost no restriction for the market. So these are the choice, right? There's some pros and there's some cons, and there are some projects that is more amenable for one financing and there's some for others. So where did this practice come from? So a lot of this comes from China's own development experience. In the 1970s, China was on the receiving end of these development loans, particularly from Japan. So you have these Japanese companies coming in, they want to set up a factory. Well, and China doesn't, at that point, this is, early 70s, they don't have any factories. So the Japanese companies, they say, well, how about we lend you some money, and then we build this factory for you, and we do some tech transfers, and in return, we get to produce whatever product, components in Chinese factories cheaply, right? So for China, so this is how we did development loans. So it's not a new policy for them. And more broadly speaking, China's own development experience, particularly with China's infrastructure development, is a very supply side driven, in the sense that they have this mentality that build it and they will come. You don't worry if you build a large housing project, you don't worry too much, at least for China at the time. You don't worry too much about who's going to live there. Don't worry, we'll build it. and, you know, people will flock over and they will, you know, they'll fill in the empty apartments. It's not a problem. And finally, there's China's own experience in development is very focused on gaining market shares and not individual firms. So there's a great book coming out by Stephen Kaplan in 2021 that talks about that. So all of these worked for China because China had a very high savings rate, but that also means that the same development pattern that China is used to and China is taking abroad right now doesn't work for everyone, right? So loans in the context of the Belt Road Initiative, this is, you know, I get a lot of questions on this. So if you think about the Belt Road Initiative is a mix of economic and strategic goals, right? Implemented by different range of agents at different levels. So you have your policymakers, you have your state-owned enterprises that are in direct conversation with your policymaker. And then you have the medium to small companies who is also trying to go abroad, right? And they don't always talk to each other. They're not always in sync, right? And what are they, so what is this BRI for? BRI is not a foreign aid project. It's China's economic and strategic project. So their goal is to secure trade and investment opportunities with the assumption that, you know, closer economic ties will spill over to strategic ties later. So you think about getting more support in multilaterals or building spheres of influence. And are they successful in terms of loan financing? So loan financing, you think about this is just one aspect of BRI. And in that aspect, they are, you know, reasonably successful, right? They have secured trade and investment opportunities for their own domestic Chinese companies. And, you know, this goes back to China's own development experience. They have a lot of state-owned enterprises.
Sorry, you said 1 minute more to wind up so that we can go to the next.
Okay. So they have been successful. I'm happy to answer questions. Another one is always access to natural resources, but it's always good to diversify your sources. But let's keep that in context, right? You know, this is from the Observatory Economic Complexity. Petroleum in 2019 is $200 billion. Most of it is from the Middle East and Russia. You know, some from Angola, by no means the top recipient. Second largest import is iron ore. Africa is still not the largest targets. So I think we need to put in context that, well, is this debt trap diplomacy trying to access, you know, African natural resources? Well, you got to think about Africa is one of the many places. Now there are exceptions, manganese and aluminum, and they're important for manufacturing purposes, but not for domestic consumption. Okay, so there's actually more of a creditor's trap. I'm happy to answer questions on that later. Creditors for China, as opposed to the other way around. Okay. And then this is not to say debt is not a problem. It's not a new problem. It used to be that IMF was on the receiving end of being accused of debt trap diplomacy. And, you know, China, in terms of the amount they lend to Africa, here's a comparison of OECD DAC financiers comparing to China. It's actually not that big. I've done field interviews with Zambian officials and researchers on the ground a year ago. When I asked them, are you concerned about the Chinese loans? Is this going to blow up in your face? They're like, no, we're not worried about the Chinese. We're worried about the Eurobonds. And Eurobond was the exact same thing that brought Mozambique to its knees a few years back. Okay, so thank you for that. And happy to answer questions later.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your input. I'll bring in the last speaker on the panel, Ndogo Sila. I mean, even when Frank was talking about the African Union and visioning and how to self-finance, you know, Africa's initiative, I mean, he made mention of the Abuja Treaty. If you are a researcher, you've been a researcher in Africa, can you share with us some of the realities that you have found on the continent of self-financing in Africa, you know, 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sylvester. I'm really glad to be a part of this panel and to have the opportunity to exchange on a very important topic. Before answering your question, I would like to make some quick points related to the relationship between finance and trade in Africa. Because what is sad is that, well, our way of thinking about trade is a 19th century way of comparative advantage. And finance, unfortunately, does not play a significant role in this way of thinking. And the first thing I want to say about that is that there is an aspect of African trade which is really pathological. When I say pathological, is that there is a part of the African external trade that should not happen that would not happen in a sound development framework. The best example of this is the reliance on the continent on food imports. And there is a very telling statistic by the UNCTAD. Between 2016 and 2018, Africa imported 85% of its food from outside the continent, 85%. So that means there is no food self-sufficiency, no food sovereignty. So for me, this is pathological. And the AfCFTA could not change this picture. It could Africanize the pathology, but it's not enough to get rid of the pathology. Because if you want to get rid of the pathology, you have to proceed to domestic structural reforms. For example, having an appropriate banking sector that helps finance agriculture. And that is not the case, let's say, in most African countries. There is not enough financing for the agricultural sector. That's why most countries are reliant on imports while they could be self-sufficient, you see. And this could not be addressed by saying that you need more trade, you need more African trade. No, you don't need more African trade. You need to build domestic capacities so that you could achieve food sovereignty. And the thing is that when we reflect broadly, we know that this form of pathological trade is also due to a lack of trade protections, because sometimes with trade protections, you could, let's say, stimulate your domestic capabilities, but that is not the case. And what is important to highlight in this regard is that the most dominant intellectual, let's say, industrial countries, for example, Germany, Japan, and China, those are countries where the banking system is dominated by national banks. You could speak of national banking sector, while in most African countries, you do not have a national banking sector. You take the case of my country, Senegal, more than 90% of all banking assets are controlled by foreign banks. And that's why you do not have credit for production, for domestic, to build domestic capacities. For example, all the loans dedicated to the economy, only 1.7% goes to the agricultural sector. And that has been a general pattern, let's say, of countries where the banking sector is dominated by foreign banks, because they are not interested in financing the real economy. But the sad news, and this is not discussed in the debates about the African Continental Free Trade Area, is that with the AfCFTA, African countries will have to open their banking sector. For example, Ethiopia has a highly protected national banking sector, but with the AfCFTA, the Ethiopian economy will have to be much more open to a foreign direct investment in the banking sector. And for me, this is a threat in fact, for countries who want to build domestic capacities and have, let's say, a Korean national banking sector. The second point is about the payment systems in Africa, because there is also a pathology there. You see, for example, when you look at the SWIFT data, in 2017, US dollar represented 45% of Africa cross-border commercial payments, and the euro represented 30%, around 30%. While in Africa, you have, let's say, the CFA franc blocks. So the CFA franc represented 7.3% of all payment flows, while the South African rand, because you have an informal monetary zone in Southern Africa, the South African rand represented 7.2% of these commercial payment flows. But what is interesting is that while intra-African cross-border commercial payments represented 23% of all cross-border commercial payments, only 12% of these flows were using African payment routes. That means that almost half of intra-African cross-border commercial payments are using extra-African payment routes. That means, for example, when some African countries trade with their neighbors, they will go through London or through New York to trade between themselves. So it is really important for, let's say, the success of, in fact, if you want to develop intra-African trade, to have a Pan-Africanist payment and settlement system. And I think the good news is that the Afrexim Bank is working to that end to set up a Pan-African payment and settlement system. Its launch has been announced many times, but we do not have enough information about that. I think it would be important to have much more information about that. My third point and last point is that the volume and geography of trade flows are strongly influenced by the nature of financial relationships between African countries and their bilateral partners. So I agree totally with the presentation by Mrs. Wang, because in fact, if you see the geography of trade flow in Africa, you see that there is one generality. African imports first and foremost from their most important creditor. If you take the case of Francophone countries, most of the time we used to import from France because France has been for our first bilateral creditor. And now China has become a major, let's say, trade partner with African countries because China has become one of the most important, let's say, financial provider of financial loans to African countries. So that means that for powerful countries, bilateral loans and sometimes bilateral loans are a way to create export markets abroad. So as long as African countries lack strong development finance and export finance institutions, it will be hard to change the trade structure of the continent's trade in favor of a beneficial, non-pathological intra-African trade. Because generally people think that you have just to remove trade barriers, so on, and everything will go as you plan. But we are in a very competitive framework and people will trade with the partners, which will give them, let's say, some financing facilities. So as long as the likes of China, the European Union are there to provide those financing facilities, it will be difficult for African countries to change the geography of their trade flows. And this connects with the interest the European Union has, let's say, with regard to the AfCFTA. You know that the European Union has a framework to cooperate with the African Union called the Pan-Africanist Program. And if you look at this document, there are things that are really shocking for us who have been fighting the economic partnership agreements. I have the slides here. Maybe later on I could share with you. But in this document,
for the sake of time,
yeah, it is said that whatever makes the African continental free trade area go forward will be beneficial to the European Union and to the negotiations between the African continental, between the African Union and the European Union regarding the EPAs. So it is clearly said that whatever makes the AfCFTA goes forward will also be beneficial to the European Union. And that's why the AfCFTA has been funded a lot by the European Union, 72 million euro between 2014 and 2020. And even the African Trade Observatory has been funded by the European Union. And I think this is not only linked to trade, but there are also other aspects, because we know that trade is not the most important thing, but competition policy, intellectual property rights, and so on. So I leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all the panelists. We have questions, a lot of questions from the participants, and I will throw them as they come in. I have two questions to Mr. Frank from the African Mineral Development Center. Aphrodite is asking that you are the head of the African Mining Mineral Development Center. How can we leverage on mining to finance Africa's development? That would this be a good model to finance the AfCFTA? That's the first question from Aphrodite. There was another question thrown to Mr. Frank, that there was an initiative spearheaded by Paul Kagame on raising funds for the African Union. Can that work as a model to raise funds to the AfCFTA? So I mean, Mr. Frank, if you can combine these within the next 3 to 4 minutes, that would be useful. Then I can go to the other panelists.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Just a few comments, 3 comments from my last speakers. One is from our colleagues from the European Union. We appreciate all the support, but aid and trade liberalization will not support, aid will not support trade liberalization. Trade liberalization has to be trade related, and we have to trade ourselves to be able to reach where we want to go. Africa will not develop depending on trade. So the last speaker talked about the financing system. Yes, my master's degree was on financial liberalization in low-income countries. And in 1999, when I did that, I found out that this was going to happen because Africa liberalized its financial sector. The savings is very low. The national savings, the continental regional savings is very low. So the investment relies on external source of financing. And this is why we have a challenge now with the debt trap from China. This is a fact. It's not like we are trying to push it on the agenda. It's a fact. As Madam Wang said, it is actually related to natural resource access, natural resources, which is going to be the part of what I'm going to be discussing. And then obviously to have very expensive in capital economies, high profits go with high risk. That's a fact. So if you go for high interest, high interest rates, less restrictive, that's why countries are getting a problem. But it's not that we can't find our own resources. And that's the point I want to raise in terms of natural resource and mineral resource development. Most of the countries, Africa is 1.3 billion people. The gentleman that has just spoken from Senegal, we have a high import bill for the food we eat, and we don't have to go there. But at the same time, we have mortgaged our resources, our natural resources, to dates. And Madam Wang said, if you default, what then next? Because you have mortgaged yourself. The moment you mortgage yourself, you are in that trouble. Now, we have attracted a lot of investment in terms of mining, and most of the investments in Africa comes in for mining to extract. Our mineral resource sector is extractive. It is not for development, it's not for value addition, it's for extractive. We have less regional value chains to feed into that. And I don't have a problem with investment. We can attract investment in mineral resource, but we need to add value on the continent. We actually, as Africa, do not need money from anywhere to develop our Inga Dam project, which, if completed, will reduce the cost of energy to less than 2 cents per kilowatt. We don't need money from outside to do that. Africa is 1.3 billion people. We have a lot of natural resources. We have our own development banks. We have Afrexim Bank. There is China Afrexim Bank. There is Afrexim Bank. So we actually need to look internal to look at the financing, the financing model for our development. And if you look at the mineral resources, which I'm happy now to be heading, and it's not the first time, because I actually developed the African Minerals Development Center as an African institution between 2013 and 2016 when it was adopted by the heads of state. Now it is going into Guinea as an independent, autonomous institution to support member states how to develop their mineral resources. We need that, and of course, this will be in line with the African Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol. The investment protocol should look at how Africa defends itself in terms of investment. Otherwise, we are mortgaging the continent and we are not going to benefit. The model between China and Japan that Madam Wong mentioned, yes, it's fine, that was happening, but Japan was a small country. Africa is a continent of 55 countries with 1.3 billion people, and the countries that are coming in to invest for the CFTA are not coming in as continental support. We have a project as a flagship project, a high-speed train, which is supposed to be a continental. But the investment, what is more worrying is that the investment coming in is at the national level. And it actually, commits the country, and therefore the integration in terms of development suffers because you have already committed between the bilateral trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, then you cannot actually support the investment. That's why the project that Kagame was working on was having problems, because countries are already committed to other obligations, to China, to Europe, to wherever. So we need to relook. And if I'm going to answer the first question on whether the mining can leverage on this, yes, it's very important. And we're talking about regional value chains. We are going to talk about how do we now move away from our resources going into raw materials by going into value addition. We want more goods to be made. The next critical minerals of the world is the 3 Ts, is those greener minerals that are going to feed into electronic cars and so forth. Africa needs, and a lot of assembling plants for motor vehicles is coming into Africa. We have a lot of skill set. People, we don't need to have our people flying away, dying across the desert, going to look for jobs everywhere. We have the jobs on the continent, and we need to create the African continental free trade area, create that opportunity, create jobs through regional value chains. But we also want to have an investment that is pro-Africa. We want development of investment, which is development in Africa, not for Africa. Not development in Africa, but development for Africa. So you get companies, they come here, they extract all the resources, they take them because the other countries are adding value and bringing those goods back to Africa. I think that's where we are going to be looking at. So the investment that is coming, and we have Afro Champions, which is an initiative that was initiated by one of the richest guys on the continent, Aliko Dangote, is looking at $1 trillion resource mobilized internally in Africa by Africans in diaspora and Africans on the continent. We want to look at how the private sector mobilizes these resources, and the mineral resource sector is one of those key sectors. We have already, as African Union, developed an Africa Mining Vision private sector compact that looks at reducing the illicit financial flows. The illicit financial flows of companies coming on the continent and evading tax, and we are losing in excess of $100 billion annually, which is too much more than ODA that we receive from everywhere. So if we can reduce this loss of the hemorrhage through tax evasion, through investment policies at the national level that is attracting, giving away, literally giving away 100% profit repatriation, non-tax payment for a period of time, and so forth. The investment policies, investment laws at the continent are actually not conducive for Africa to develop and even to fund itself. But within the framework of the Continental Free Trade Area, we have opportunities to go back and inform our member states that you appended your signature, you ratified the Abuja Treaty, you have ratified the Agenda 23, you need to put your money where your mouth is, and that's within the supporting the investment on the continent. So we are looking at how do we move from that. Africa is focused. We cannot blame China for coming in because China knows what they want. They have said we don't want restrictions because we want your real natural resources. We can't blame them, but Africa has to come and know what we want ourselves. And when we are engaging with our partners, we go for Africa first, not because China wants to give us money. No, we need to go for Africa first. America goes for America first. Europe goes for Europe first. China goes for China first. We have to look at Africa first. And that's why African Continental Free Trade Area provides this. The Africa and member states has been a challenge in integration. But when you look at the Lagos Plan of Action, you look at the Abuja Treaty, they are quite clear. The heads of state then knew where Africa has to go. So it's incumbent on the experts at the continental level to go back to heads of state and member states, say, this is where you appended your signature. This is where you want to go. When you talk about the Kagame's resource mobilization strategy, it wasn't conclusive itself because countries were scared because most of it was going to be tied to tourism, which was not right. But if you look at, for instance, telecommunications, just telecommunications, before you even go into mining, if one cent of a dollar of the airtime that people, my mother died at 90 and we're still paying airtime, but all that money goes out of the continent. If we actually charge 1 cent of any dollar for airtime, for the network, that people come in and use our airspace and get all those resources and move away. If we get the companies that come to invest in Africa, put just 5% or 1% of what they make or their turnover, we shall mobilize resources for investing in Africa, and we not need to look to China, we not look to Europe, we not need to look to Eurobonds. We shall be able to internally mobilize resources for our investment. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Just a follow-up question. You see, when you look into the AfCFTA, we allow export taxes. Countries can actually charge export taxes, of course, for a short while. In the EPAs, we do not export. Most of the export taxes are prohibited in the EPAs. As a financing model, will the African Union say, okay, any mineral that's been extracted from the continent, and you are leaving the minerals leaving the continent, you impose an export tax. You see, that was a problem. You mentioned Kagame, because of the different trade regimes that we have with different continents and countries, it becomes so murky and becomes a problem. Will you, at the African Union, take a look at the issue of export taxes, for example, as a financing model?
You see, we have African Continental Free Trade Area. It operates within the wider World Trade Organization. We have to be looking at how we don't infringe it, because we are going into trade rules based. But there are innovative strategic means, because every country can have a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have to even tax exports on whatever. If we add value to our resources and people put money into geological information, they put money into supporting the investment, supporting the continental, the people who want to invest, the diaspora. We have quite a lot. China has depended on diaspora in terms of skills revolution, in terms of attracting investment. Africa has a huge lot of diaspora outside. But yes, we can actually do that in a way that is innovative. West African Economic Community doesn't, depend on member state funding. It has a community levy. So we have opportunities that we can look on and leverage on the continent and say that, look, if you are investing in Africa, if an investor comes in and they are putting money into the mineral resource sector. At one point, we were working with African Union Foundation based in South Africa that is mandated to mobilize the private sector financing to say, why don't we mobilize all the private sector in the mineral resource sector and say, we do not need corporate social responsibility. We need corporate social investment. We need corporate investment. We don't need you to come and put in money and say we're going to build a road. Give us the money and we shall build the road ourselves. We don't need to tie our social needs, our government public needs to those who are going to do it for us. They can't do it for us. Earlier on, Wong mentioned that sewage cannot raise funding. That's unfortunate because you don't. Waste management is actually a lucrative business. Waste management crossover. We are going into a circular economy. People are looking at management and recycling. So there is a lot that can be done. Waste management goes into fertilizer. We don't need to import anything. So sewage can actually make money on the continent. Opposed to what Ms. Wong was saying. So Africa needs to put its house in order, and then we can be able to finance our AfCFTA. Otherwise, we shall have to, because anybody who is coming to finance us, as our colleague from Senegal said, is looking at the market. We have 1.3 billion people market. The middle class is increasing. So we are going to have a continental free trade area, big as it is, across 55 countries, with goods coming in from China, from elsewhere, crossing the border, when we are not even doing our own manufacturing, our own value addition, when we have the resources, we have the skills, and all we need to do is put some investment to attract technology and technological know-how. That's all we need.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank. We have Graham from Politico. Of course, we are live on Facebook, and he's asking, what can we make of the current and the increasing debt of Africa to China? How does this affect policy space? This is a question thrown to Jiang. He's asking of the debt. I saw Zambia and Mozambique and other countries that you painted. He's asking the question about what can we do about this debt overhang, to China. Your comments, please.
Yes. So make sure I understand the question. Like, what can we do with the debt they currently have with China, or what can they do with the potential to access?
How does this affect the policy space? If you increase your debt to some level, it becomes the policy instruments are being clamped. It's a point. Even on the table, you have no power because you are a debtor to China, and so China can have its own way on the continent. That's the angle he's looking at.
Yeah. So it really depends on what type of loan, what kind of financial arrangement you have with China. So Frank mentioned earlier about resources. Yes, there are natural resource security to loans is something that China uses to reduce the risk when they lend to African governments, right? So these tend to be large billion-dollar credit lines. You think about Angola, think about DRC. they all have things like this. And most of these go into financing infrastructure projects. The argument being that, well, we need this, we're going to sink money into the infrastructure. We need this money now. And presumably they would generate revenue for the country, then we pay it back. And from China's perspective, I think Frank makes a really good point that, people coming into Africa knows what they want. What China wants is, well, either I get access to natural resources, or even if I'm not interested in natural resources, I want some kind of security for the loans that I am lending, $2-3 billion going to the Republic of Congo. How do I make sure, how does China Exim Bank make sure they get their money back? Well, let's put a resource security on it. Now, even within resource security, there are ones that are more manageable than others. So in Angola, they have a long history of doing resource security loans with China. They have a good relationship such that when oil prices tanked and Angola, they are in a fiscal problem, China was willing to renegotiate the terms, extend the terms, and reduce the interest rate with them. That is not true for all countries, right? You have to have a good relationship with China for you to pull that off. And then you have so these are the more above board, actually, resource security loan. And then you have the more problematic ones, which are actually resource prepayments. So you see a lot of this in Sudan, for example, where these are not even, this is not even China. This is to commodity sellers abroad. I mean, this is your Glencore, this is your Trafigura that wants to buy oil. And what they're doing is basically saying that, pay us 500 million right now, Sudan to say Trafigura, pay us 500 million right now and we'll send you a tanker or 7 tankers of oil next year. All right. So to a certain extent, that is kind of a loan. And the thing is, those are really short-term, interest rates are very high and very untransparent. So those are pretty dangerous. So in terms of concerns of, well, what do we do about these loans? From what I can tell from the Zambian government, they don't seem to be worried. Like I was surprised at their answer. I thought they would be concerned. And I think that was, a year and a half ago. I think they were right at the edge of the Eurobond crisis. So everyone I talked to, they're just like, Chinese loans, they're not even that much in proportional to their debt profile. B, they're really cheap. C, what's China going to do to us if we default on it? They seem not concerned at all. They are very concerned with the Eurobond. Everyone's sweating when they're talking about the Eurobond. So this is bad because it's actually much harder to renegotiate the terms with the market, with the Eurobond, than you can with China. Now, the thing is, access to Chinese financing, it has become an opportunity in the past 20 years. Think of it as a high stakes game, right? This is, as Frank says, with high profits comes high risk. It's true for China. So China has a higher risk tolerance of where they're willing to lend their money, even if there's a high chance they're not getting their money back. And on the flip side of that is a high stakes game for African borrowers as well. It's like, yes, where formerly no one will lend you $3 billion to build a railway. Now someone will do it. Do you do it? Right? That's a really, it's tempting. And the thing is, some countries come out the other end better off than other, and it really depends on whether you have your policies in order or not, right? So it's an opportunity that comes at a great cost.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question from a student at Hamburg University, and is asking Ndogo and Trosta. I mean, you can respond to this. He's asking that how can Ecowas end the continuant monetary policy dependence on France? He's saying the current currency, franc wars, in quotes, in Ecowas, how about this water down the implementation of the AfCFTA? And how can Ecowas end the continuing monetary dependence, on France? So maybe in Ndogo Sila, of course, I can see Trosta. Any of you, both of you can respond from your different perspectives. That's fine.
Well, I did not hear the question very well. Could you?
He's asking, how can ECOWAS end the continued monetary policy dependence on France within the context of the franc?
Well, in fact, the ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. So it's a regional grouping of 15 countries. including the 8 that use the CFA franc, which is a colonial currency, born in 1945, but still functioning like a colonial currency. And the Ecowas has a single currency project for, let's say, all the 15 countries. But we know that, there have been many hurdles for this regional grouping. So they planned to launch it last year, but it was not possible. And for many, it seems that this could be an alternative to the CFA franc. But for myself, even if we had the possibility to launch this regional single currency, for me, it would not solve African development challenges because having your own currency is really important for a nation. You have to be coherent about the policy framework. If decisions are taken at the national level, you have to have the appropriate instrument at the national level. If you want to have, let's say, a regional currency, I think the first step should be to try to move towards a federal political union with a federal treasury. If we don't have that, we'll be in the scenario of the Eurozone, which is for me really dysfunctional. That means you have the monetary responsibilities at the community level, while you have the budgetary responsibilities at the national level. This is not coherent at all. And when you don't have your own currency, you could not also design your banking sector as you want. You want to do it in a way that will help you build domestic capacities. So it's really important that African countries have national banking sector. If they don't have national banking sector, it will be really difficult for them to finance their development. I know that there are many hubs around the African continental free trade area, but the African continental free trade area is no panacea. You have to have the appropriate instrument at the national level, because for now we don't have a single, let's say, African country. We are not, for now, let's say, a single country. We are 55 countries. So that means that we have to find appropriate instruments at the national level. And the banking sector is really important to that end. And unfortunately, in the CFA franc countries, the banking sector, even if it diversified, because now the dominant ones are the Moroccan banks and so-called Pan-African banks, but still they are functioning during the colonial period. That means they are just on short-term activities, financing short-term activities, and no credit for, let's say, no financing for long-term activities. Just one statistic, you take again the case of Senegal, 77% of all bank loans have a duration of less than 1 year, 44% of all bank loans have a duration of less than 1 month. If you have such kind of, let's say, banking sector infrastructures, you cannot develop. It's impossible.
Okay. Trosta, before you come in, there's a question that maybe you could just combine. That Germany has committed 50 million euros to support the AfCFTA. Is this meant to make Africa accept the movement on the ongoing negotiations with EU on the post-Cotonou and the compact with Africa? This is from Lipelo Rivers, South Africa. Maybe you can combine with the first question, that would be fine.
Yeah, I guess there is ongoing debate actually to also from Germany and the Ministry for Development there to have another driver going towards Africa. The main point here is also, well, the post-Cotonou agreement or something, the negotiations, they have been finished up last year, and the text, I didn't see the full text for now, but it's also kind of a framework that they agreed on, and I guess it's much more on the political side. I guess we have to see how this will find out. But what is important that especially the German government tried to change the investment policy towards Africa, meaning that more private investors actually target the African country and invest in African countries directly. The European Union also envisioned that by their internal investment plan. But what is the problem? Meaning that beforehand we heard about that it's like huge risk comes with huge profit, but obviously none of the European or very few European companies actually believed in the profits that are possible or didn't want to go for the risk. So what the governments actually said is to subsidize then investments. Either you do guarantees, public guarantees, or you use the public development banks that raise funds and support private companies to invest in Africa. So it's, I guess, the narrative that it's that there is the prospects and the huge market with 1.3 billion people there. I think that many European companies don't really believe in that vision for now, and they need government support and guarantees to start an investment. And then that's a sign for me that it's not actually too attractive for the private sector from the European side to believe in the prospects in the near future for the African continent. Yeah, and what is also important here is somewhat then the contradiction with the economic partnership agreement, because the economic partnership agreement, we had that before in the chat or something. The point is that once they should be signed, or they will be signed, then the African countries have to open up their import side. So European companies can export to the African continent without any tariff barriers or something. So it's like open up for it. So the point is that why should you invest and produce in Africa to sell them products in Africa when you can just ship it and export it from Europe and where you have your processes, and the European companies also invested in China and Southeast Asia, so their production also shifted to these areas. And potentially, if you open up then the whole trade on a global scale, and you don't open up spaces where you can develop an internal African market, then it's not attractive to invest there and instead just trade.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question from Frank of the African Union. I think 3 comments. Frank, the first one is, Victoria is asking about inclusion, that we take decisions at the African Union AfCFTA Secretariat level. But how do member states ensure that there's participation for all stakeholders? So it's a question about inclusion, participation in the AfCFTA processes. So that is the first one. The second one is that in the midst of the pandemic, if you listen, we are asking companies and citizens are asking states to come to their aid and to make sure that states can actually revamp and support companies and all that. With the notion that the process is, I mean, the picture he's painting about European Union actually pushing a lot of private sector investment in Africa. In the time of pandemic, you call on the state. So what can you do? I mean, at the African Union level, what can you do about, because we need a strong state in such a way, developmental state in a way that can actually support the citizens when there's a pandemic. And the pandemic is a clear example, a reminder of what is ahead of us. And the last bit is that when I was talking about the export taxes, I mean, within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, there's no agreement that says you cannot impose an export tax. What is causing a problem is the bilateral investment treaties and regional treaties like EPAS and all that. In fact, Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia actually use an export tax to develop the leather sector, in Ethiopia. Those are some of the comments, and then the examples on the continent that you can push from the Secretariat as the African Union level. So maybe your comments on the question from Victoria. Mr. Frank.
Sorry, I'm still muted. I think Africa needs investments, and definitely we need the investments from all our partners, including more importantly Europe, and others, and China and other partners, where technological advancement has proceeded as far as possible, much more than in Africa, because we need technological transfer. but we need investment to come in Africa on our terms. That's what should be the most important part. We need investment coming in our terms, not on their terms, because the challenge we have here, we have a continental free trade area. So far, almost 37 or more countries are ratifying or have ratified, but where investment laws and treaties are still being sovereign. And all these people coming in, including EPAs, are leaving the SEATI, on the side and then going on country by country. This is going to cause us problems in terms of advancement. So we need investment. We need them in regional value chains. As I said earlier on, we have a number of assembling plants for motor vehicles and others. These needs inputs. We can have inputs, value chain for inputs. Europe and China and Japan depend on small and medium enterprises who produce these small inputs going in. They don't depend on large investments. The large investments, they come in, even don't pay tax in most of the cases, but we have our small industries which are suffering and being crowded out by these huge investments, and they're not being catered for. So we need to put efforts to say we need investments, but when they come on the continent, they should be looking at regional rather than national. If we continue to have these bilateral treaties, investment treaties, and we are trying to implement a continental free trade area, we should still have a challenge that my colleague Ndongo was referring to, that we are continuing to be an importer of food which we can actually produce on the continent. So, agro-food value addition, yes, but it should be looking at, in a value chain, every stage of the value chain is a market for the other, for the previous one. Agriculture producing at optimal yield per hectare feeds into another sector for processing and for manufacturing. Mineral resources feed into refineries and they feed into manufacturing in light industries, metallurgical. So we need, and they go into pharmaceuticals. So we need to have attractive investment, but into what we need. And this is manufacturing and value addition. And that's why I mentioned the Afro Champions investment framework that is looking at generating 1 billion within the next 10 years. That's about 1 trillion US dollars within the next 10 years. And that means it's 100 billion within every year. But that should be investment by Africans and diaspora, but also getting other partners, but who come in, join that framework so that we are generating financing on our continent. We have African Bank is supporting that process. And if we have to go to African Bank, we have to attract domestic and regional investment, cross-border investments. And that will help us to move forward. But we'll still try attract investment, but we need to have it within the framework of the investment protocol that is going to be more conducive for Africa. Instead of saying, oh, put a conducive environment to attract investment from China, from Europe, when these people come and take everything and then you start crying fouls. I think we should not move from that point to be able to achieve our agenda 2063.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes to go. I have a number of issues that have been raised. And the first one is about a clear financing framework for the AfCFTA. So Frank mentioned about the Afro Champions framework. That should be on the terms of Africa. That is one we need to note. There is a need to direct funding to the real sectors of economy. Ndogo Sila mentioned about the food import in Africa, and that is frightening. Of course, you have been with us for decades. So we need to be able to control finance and then direct the finance into the sectors that are of critical to Africa. There's a third point about that came up in terms of investment. That yes, investment might be on the terms of Africa, and so the investment rules must start from the reality that is confronting Africa today. And African countries are commodity-dependent countries, and we need to be aware of that. Of course, external funding is on the increase, but that has to be in line with our priorities as Africa. And so these are some of the things that came up. And it's important that we also highlight some of the challenges that came up. One of them is the member states' interest. The issue about the Kagame's plan that is struggling to succeed because of the different recs and the member states' interest, and the different regimes, whether it is the post-Cotonou, whether it's the regional agreements that we have, whether it is a bilateral agreement, let's say Kenya and in the US. these investment agreements have a bearing on how Africa can develop. And so this is what some of the things I was able to capture. We have about 5 to 10 minutes to go. I want to now hand over if there's no any question, I want to ask Jane to give some closing remarks, and then we thank the speakers and call it a day. So Jane Laluga, he is the executive director of SEATINI. Jane will make some closing remarks, and then we can say thank you to the speakers and all of you as participants.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks, Sylvester, for a very good moderated session. And thanks also to our very able panelists. I'm speaking on behalf of the organizers of this webinar, that's Rosalux Stiftung and SEATINI Uganda. It was a very good discussion. So many issues came up, and issues around how to finance the CFTA, but also broadly on how to finance our development initiatives as Africa. But what also came out clearly was that we need to rethink the CFTA. We need to rethink liberalization before production. Is that a wise move? And we also need to rethink the way we reorganize our national and regional economies around reorganizing the financial sector, the agriculture sector, the whole issue around investment, how do we handle that? So I think as Africa, we need to do a lot more thinking, a lot of more reorganization of our economy. And I hope that the AU, the CFTA Secretariat, and our national policymakers were listening. But what we are going to do as organizers is to be able to write out the recommendations and issues coming out of this webinar so that we can be able to share them with the powers that be. Because it's important that we do implement most of these issues, the very good ideas coming out. I would like to thank the people behind the organizing this webinar, Mr. Africa Chiza and Sam Kasirye from LOSA Foundation. To SEATINI and LOSA, we have been organizing these webinars to ensure that trade in Africa and trade initiatives work for the people, and to ensure that people's voices are heard. And in fact, we are discussing here with our team that maybe we should have had these meetings, webinars, before the launch of the negotiations of the CFTA. But that's what under the bridge, and we hope we can be able to make a difference in the way the CFTA is being negotiated in the upcoming phases and also in the implementation. We have other webinars which are going to come up. In June, we have a webinar on migration and the labor market, again in the context of the CFTA. And in August, we have one on the impact on agriculture. But what we're also proposing is that if anybody has an issue which is really important and burning, we can also put it on the agenda and be able to debate it. Because at the end of the day, what we want to ensure is that all these initiatives and programs work for Africa, work for the people. So thank you so much once again, Sylvester, our panelists, and all the participants who have made this webinar really, really interesting and very beneficial. Thank you so much. And until another webinar, do keep safe.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you for organizing the event.
Yeah. Thank you.